Hey guys, it's Nate here with a video on 5 tips for a successful data science interview. Today we're going to do something different. I'm going to bring in a few data experts from the YouTube community. All of us have had years of experience in various data roles like data analyst, data scientist, data engineer, and we've been through the gamut of the interview process, one of the most stressful parts before getting a job. So today we're going to be giving you guys tips on certain topics of the data science interview process. So topics like coding, behavioral questions, machine learning, modeling, statistics, and product sense. Basically all of the topics covered in an interview and tips on how to succeed in them. So the goal is to give you tips on how to successfully prepare for these topics. We know that interviewers are going to be testing you on these topics and it can be a very stressful situation. So we're here to give you some tips on basically what has worked for us in our careers. Okay, so let's get started. I hope you guys like this video. If you like content like this, please subscribe to this channel. All the other channels are also listed in the description below. So I'll get started. I'll kick things off. Let's start with coding. Okay, so Nate here with the first tip on coding questions. So what are coding questions on data science interviews? Well, these are analytical questions that require coding for you to answer. So a big portion of what the interviewer is obviously testing for are your technical skills in coding, right? Whether it be in SQL, Python, R, whatever language you want to use to actually get to an answer. So that's a big portion of what they're testing, but they're really also testing on how you think about answering the question, how you break down the question, and then how you communicate that question or that solution to the interviewer. So what they're evaluating you on is whether or not you can break down a complicated question. Can you develop a logical approach? And then do you understand and can you identify all of the corner cases, edge cases, and all the different scenarios that can happen when trying to answer the question? And then can you communicate all of this to the interviewer? So they're testing you on both your technical skills, but also your soft skills. And that could get really difficult. So my advice is really to practice as much as possible. So the first tip I have is to practice as much as possible on real interview questions. I remember when I was trying to prepare for my data science interviews, what I did was I went on several sites to try to identify and collect as many real interview questions as possible. So I went on sites like Glassdoor to basically just find these questions and see whether or not I can answer them. And then I went on sites like LeetCode, HackerRank, my own site StrataScratch, to also try to find these interview questions from these companies that I was interviewing at. And then I would basically just practice solving all of these questions. I would also couple that with the communication aspect that I was talking about. Basically communicating out how I'm actually breaking down these questions to come up with the solution, breaking down the assumptions, identifying the corner cases, and then writing out the code to get to the solution. Which brings me to tip number 2. How do I properly break down a question? And then how do I properly communicate this to the interviewer? So I essentially use a 3-step approach in my framework in terms of how I would break down this problem for an interviewer. So the first step is to explore that data set, explore the data. So what you want to do is essentially map out all of the data columns and map it to the question. So that you know exactly what columns you're going to need to use in your code to come up with a solution. And then as you are exploring the data, or at least the data columns, you're communicating with that interviewer about all of the assumptions needed to be clarified in order for you to come up with a solution. So then once you understand the data, once you've identified and clarified the assumption, number 2 is to write the solution before writing out the code to the solution. And so what I always do is I'll write down step by step exactly how I'm going to solve the problem in just bite-sized steps, right? And I'm going to write it out, and I'm not writing out any code yet. I'll write down every single step and I'll communicate every single step with the interviewer. So what that does is, 1, it basically forces the interviewer to listen to you and to validate whether or not your steps are correct. And so if they say all of your steps are correct, then all you have to do is code it up, right? The second benefit is that this provides a roadmap for you when you're coding. So the coding portion could be really stressful because you're coding and you might lose your train of thought. You're trying to also communicate with the interviewer, but if you already have all of the steps written out, you're just coding step by step and you're just like plugging away until you reach the last step and then you're done. So that's the benefit of basically writing down all of the steps to the solution. Which then brings me to the third and final step in my framework, code up the solution. So all you're gonna really need to do again is just code up everything in the steps that you wrote down already and just make sure you're communicating with the interviewer exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. The best part here is that interviewer has already told you that your approach is correct from the second step, right? So all you have to do is code it up. So that's my 3-step approach. It's really nice to have a framework that you can use during a stressful environment, during an interview, so that you always know what you need to do in order to progress through the question. All right, so those are my tips on how to succeed in the coding portion of a data science interview. I'm gonna hand it to Tina to talk about tip number 2.
Hi everyone, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tina and I'm currently a data scientist at a FANG company in tech. So today I'll be talking with you guys about product questions. First, I'll talk about why product questions are important for data scientists, what interviews are looking for, and finally, how to prepare for product questions. So first off, why are product questions important? The reason is because data scientists don't work in isolation. You're probably working with a product manager or at least a business-based person, even if you're not working specifically on a product, as well as engineers and a lot of different other people as well. So the work that you do contributes directly towards the product you're building or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And that means that you have to have a good understanding of what it is that's trying to be built so that you can align the work that you do and you can actually implement it in that product. In terms of what interviewers are looking for, I would say that there's 5 things that interviewers are looking for, and I actually wrote them down just to make sure I don't forget. Number 1 is analytical and logical thinking. What analytical and logical thinking is having a product that's there and being able to translate that into a way that can be solved with data science. So this is really important in the very, very beginning because whatever it is that you're going to be doing with your data science, it has to match up with the actual product itself. So the questions that interviewers would be looking for is this person able to take the context that's over there in the business side and actually translate that into a problem that can be solved using data science? Number 2 is product sense. Product sense refers to your understanding of the product as a whole. This is kind of holistic in nature, but it's about your ability of understanding context and not just being stuck on problem solving and the technical details. Do you understand why this product is important? What's the purpose of this product? Why do people care about this product? Where do you think this product is going to fit into the entire ecosystem? Things like that. Number 3 is communication. So communication, I don't think I need to go into too much detail about this. It's basically after you do your data science, you do all this really cool analysis. Are you able to actually communicate that to the partners that you're working with as well as leadership so that they can implement the things that you find? Number 4 is problem solving abilities. So this is something that's like, okay, now that you know what the problem is and you know that you can use data science to solve it, are you able to come up with a clear framework or an approach to solving this problem? So it's thinking about how can we now take this problem, scope it in such a way, and actually follow through with it so that we can end up with a result that can be applied again so that we can make the product better. And number 5 is flexibility. This is where in sometimes interviews you actually see the interviewer just kind of throwing you a curveball, being like, okay, after you think about all these different things, and they're like, oh, actually, there's this other component that you should consider as well. And the reason for this is that they want to see if you're able to be flexible, because in the real industry environment, things pop up all the time. Like things they actually never really go as expected. So are you able to adapt to these changes, or is it going to throw you off? They're looking for people who are able to adapt, able to tailor and change whatever analysis they're doing, whatever frameworks that they're thinking with, so that it actually suits the product. Number 3 is tips for practice. It's hard to actually find a lot of product-based questions, I think, and it's even harder to find solutions from all over the internet in data science. But when I was preparing, what I realized is that these product questions are really similar to what product management questions are and also management consultant. So I actually highly recommend that you look at some management consultant frameworks in the way that they approach business questions and apply that into a specific product. And by the way, this is also what product managers do, just it's like this, it's a similar framework, except it's applied directly into product-based questions. And you can practice using these frameworks and practice those questions. And then you can actually directly apply them to your interview as well.
Is this thing on? Oh, I'm Luke, by the way. I'm a data analyst, and for this, I'm going to be sharing my tip for how to handle behavioral questions. So what are behavioral questions, and why are even employers asking you these questions? These questions are utilized in order to gain a better understanding of how you're going to handle different situations that you're going to be placed within a company. So here are some examples of some common behavioral questions that typically come up in data science interviews. The main thing that they're going to present you with is some sort of question that allows you to showcase how you encountered a conflict and then how you resolved that conflict. So what is the purpose of these questions? It's in order for the employer to understand how you're going to respond in these type of situations and to make sure that you're actually a good fit for the team itself. My strategy for handling these behavioral questions is broken into two main parts. So the first part is you need to think about your past and what you've been through and come up with 4 to 5 stories that you can utilize that demonstrated some sort of conflict and also demonstrated some sort of resolution. Personally, when I was going through my job search a few years ago, I had 5 stories ready to go that had some sort of climax and some sort of resolution that I could adapt based on the behavioral question presented to me. It is very important that you have your own personal story for these behavioral questions, because if you're talking in a hypothetical situation like I would have done this, it's not going to be as memory impacting on the interviewer. Also, they're not going to feel like you have the experience because you don't have a story to showcase for the question asked. The second part is now implementing those stories in a STAR technique to answer the question given. And what is STAR? So STAR is how you set up the storyline in order to better answer the question. First, you're going to start with that situation for them to understand what is the context of the storyline. From there, looking at the task, what is your responsibilities during this? From there, moving into the action. What actions did you take or maybe not take? And then finally, the most important thing is the result. What type of beneficial result came out of your action? And then from there, the best thing that you can do to handle this is practice. So utilize that STAR technique in starting to answer those 4 to 5 stories that you may have. Practice in front of a video camera, in front of the mirror. I think practicing with other friends and sharing your story helps you iterate quicker and understanding what your flaws are in your story. Bam! So there you have it. That's my tip, or should I say 2 tips for mastering your behavioral questions, is that 1, you need to have 4 to 5 stories ready to go, and 2, you need to practice implementing those stories in a STAR technique. Okay, with that, I'll give it back to Nate.
Back to me, Nate here again with a tip on machine learning, statistics, and modeling type questions on your next data science interview. So generally, these are non-coding type of questions, but what the interviewer is trying to do is test your technical knowledge on both the theory and implementation on these 3 topics. So the questions you're going to get fall in 1 or 2 buckets. Do you know your theory? Have you implemented it? So my tip in terms of how to prove that you know both the theory and have implemented these models is to have a few personal project stories. And by a few, I mean 2 to 3 stories where you can talk in detail and in depth about a project, a data science project that you've done in the past. You should be able to answer questions like, why did you choose this model? What assumptions do you need to validate in order to use this model correctly? What are the trade-offs with that model? So if you're able to answer these questions, you're basically proving to the interviewer that you know both the theory and have implemented the model in the project. And this could be an academic project, a personal project, or a project that you've done in your last job. And so some of the common modeling techniques that you'll need to know are regressions And then machine learning ones like random forest, k-nearest neighbor, gradient boosting. These are the common models that almost every data scientist should know and maybe have some experience implementing. And so I touched a little bit about proving that you know how to implement a model. The best way to do this, like I said before, is talk about a story, talk about a personal project that you've done in the past. To me, this is the best way to showcase your knowledge about these techniques. Interviewers want to see that you've actually gotten your hands dirty and implemented these models. There's so much more to just implementing a model. There are a lot of other things that you need to know to be a data scientist, to be an effective data scientist. So in addition to just implementing the models, you're needing to clean the data, build a data pipeline. There's the model implementation, of course, but there's also interpreting the results and communicating the results to stakeholders and all of these other aspects to just implementing the model. So if you can prove to the interviewer that you know the entire data science process from end to end, from obtaining the data all the way to explaining the results to a stakeholder, and explain in detail exactly why you performed each step, I believe that the interviewer would definitely be satisfied in knowing that you actually are able to complete data science projects. I'm an interviewer for my company, and that's exactly what I look for when I'm interviewing candidates. So the next and final tip is going to come from Ben.
Thank you, Nate, so much for that introduction and just getting all of us together here in this video. And as you guys have realized, we have covered a ton of topics in terms of tips and tricks and sections that you'll need to cover in terms of preparing for your data science, data engineering interview. And that's one of the major challenges you'll face as you're going forward is how do you actually prepare for these interviews in a way that's effective? And honestly, back in my day, which wasn't that long ago, but long enough ago where there was just a whole host of problems that were everywhere along the internet. You had LeetCode, HackerRank, and those still exist, but there's just a whole host of services that give you a more organized and structured process in terms of how you prepare for your interviews that really make it a little easier. But regardless, I still have a way that I like approaching how I prepare, both for the long term, which is, preparing for the interview that's 2 to 3 months out, as well as short term in terms of the night before. So for the long term, I've actually put together several guides in the past where you can actually look them up over here in the corner, where I would just break it out section by section, similar to the sections that we've covered here in this interview, where we would have things like machine learning models, statistics, and different sections of something like a data science interview that you'll likely go through, especially if you go at a FANG, and broke them all out and had clear links to questions that would be more like pre-questions, some post-questions, and like some videos and content in between that you could kind of study, and then try the pre, see how you do on them, see where your weaknesses are, write some notes on them here. You can see there's a little bit of a note section over there. And basically the whole point there was to kind of keep track, was like, were you weak? Were you fast? Were you slow? Like, keep track of those little bits of information because that will let you know where you need to practice on. And that's really the point of the guides that I'd put together in the past, was you need to be able to track this because there's just so much you can cover. If you're not keeping track of what you've studied and where you're weak, it's going to be really hard for you to really improve because you have no idea where to improve. And generally, I think most of us tend to go towards the questions that we get right more, where we should really be focusing on questions that we get wrong more. So that's kind of the purpose of the guide that I put together, was for me to point out where was I weak, where I need to study more, and even to keep little notes on how I did in interviews and where I was weak in an interview section. Did I feel like I did really poorly in like a coding section? Did I need to code or improve in a certain area? And that's one way to prepare in terms of the long term. Because again, in the long term, you're going to lose track of all of these different details of things that you've studied and the gaps that you have. So putting together a guide like this is one way to ensure that you keep track of everything step by step. Now, in short term, in terms of preparation, let's say like the night before, I often tell people, don't study anything. It's the night before, you probably need to relax, and trying to cram that last little bit of information in before an exam, personally for me, it just kind of feels like it ends up clogging up my mind and I don't feel as fresh and on point in terms of the interview the next day. So I think it's often better to get a full night's rest and just be ready, have a good meal the next day, be relaxed as possible, because that's when you're going to perform at your best. It's actually not that uncommon when you look at things like boxers and UFC fighters. They don't necessarily train a night before because they don't want to get sore or weak the night before. You want to be fresh. You want to be at your peak strength. And if you've worked out really hard the day before, you're likely just going to be very depleted and exhausted to have a full-on fight. So oftentimes it's better to rest and be relaxed the day before you have a big interview versus trying to cram that last little bit into your brain. So I hope you guys all have a great day, and I'm going to turn this back over to Nate.
All right, I hope you guys love these tips from my friends from the YouTube community of data scientists and data experts. I encourage you all to visit their channels. All of the links are in the description below. All right, good luck on your next data science interview. Thanks.